Hey, everybody, this is Monica Walmsley with Pastor James, and we're here for Sunday Unpacked.
Hello.
We're gonna be talking about the sermon that James preached on Sunday, November 10th, and it is on kingdom. S
Yes. That was a
yeah,
little different for this series, right? Because the others were all
yeah,
virtues that we should pursue. And this
yeah,
was something totally different from all that, which
yeah,
was good, but sort of challenging.
yeah, I bet. Um, I like how your main points were, that politics is important, but it'll fade away.
Hmm.
That while issues matter now, they may not matter later, and that nationality does not define who we are for eternity.
Right.
A-
Right.
And as Christians, we're part of an eternal kingdom, but that nationality does not define who we are for eternity really um, was probably the biggest point, I would say, in the whole sermon
Yeah.
or
And I
the
think the one
series.
that, well, it probably sums up everything we've said
Yeah.
all along. And maybe the hardest one for us to wrap our minds around because we just automatically, for right or wrong, and I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong, but we think about ourselves as Americans,
Mhm.
and that's just who I am. And to adjust that thinking, yes, I am an American, but there's this thing out there that's bigger than that. That I'm a
Mhm.
follower of Jesus that is going to outlast my citizenship in the United States. I think that's an adjustment for a lot of us because we're so tied to nationality. And that's how people around our world are. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the first things they would tell you if you were in a foreign country or they were here is, well, where are you from? And we would answer that. So
Right.
sort of changing that mentality, I think is hard for all of us.
Yeah. I think being not in Christian ministry full time, I think it's something that in your job or your position outside of the church, you have to practice that mentality. I'm a
Yeah.
Christian first before I'm a nurse. I'm a Christian first, and my loyalty is to what is right in God's eyes. What can I do? How can I best do my job and exemplify Christ? Whether
Right.
I'm able to solve a problem here or not, I able to show who Christ is?
Right. So the bigger issue that we've alluded to is identity.
Mhm.
So whether our identity is tied up in the work we do or in our nationality or in I'm a mom, I'm a husband, I'm a daughter, whatever that is,
Right.
those things all matter and they say something about who we are, but they're always subordinate to understanding ourselves as followers of Jesus. So it's always going to be, I'm a dad who is a follower of Jesus. And so that being a follower of Jesus should dictate what it means to be a dad,
Right.
right? And I think that's the challenge and the joy of being a Christian, right? Because that makes life, we have to think through that. We have to be creative. We have to work on that from, as soon as we sort of have consciousness and understand what following Jesus is for the rest of our lives, we're always going to be asking that question. What does it mean for me to follow Jesus in this setting, in this part of my life as a, coworker, spouse, parent, child,
Right.
grandchild, all those issues.
A lot of this sermon reminded me of your series, I Am Who You Say I Am.
Yeah, there's similar themes. That's right.
Just because this is about if we're walking and living out who he says we are, then the political polarization should really have no part in the church
Correct. Correct.
and in our lives. Um, you know, you the politics in Jesus' day were just as polarized between the Jewish leaders um, and the Jewish people's view of the coming Messiah. There's still,
Right.
you've got Jewish Christians, but the Jews still are polarized about Jesus and his messiahship and who he was. Um,
Absolutely. And, you know, you have all kinds of polarization in the ancient world,
mhm,
and especially if we're thinking about the life of Jesus and the life of the early church.
right.
So a big part of that is, okay, you've got in Jesus' lifetime, you've got different groups of Jews that have very different understandings of what it means to follow Yahweh and to follow the law. And
Mhm,
even are there obligations? Is there an understanding of God outside the law? So what do we do with the prophets? What do we do with the poetic books of the Old Testament, the writings they called them? Um, so there's that, and then you add in the fact that you've got an occupying force in Judea and Galilee of Roman soldiers and a Roman governor, and so you've got all these forces at work in Jesus' life, and they're all competing in different ways. And sometimes you have groups that are allied against other groups, and sometimes they're at war with one another. And Jesus is right in the middle of all of that. And just like today, all of that polarization and all of those groups have their effect on Jesus' ministry and even the way he dies. So Jesus understood what it meant to live in a polarized culture, as did the early church, because they inherited much of that. And now you have, okay, these are Christians, some of them Jews, some of them Gentiles, and how do they understand themselves in relation to the world that they've sort of walked away from, and how do they understand themselves in relationship to each other now that they're followers of Jesus coming from very different backgrounds. So this is not new. The groups have changed, the lineup has changed, but this sense that the culture is divided was at work just as
mm,
much in the first century as 21st century.
yeah. Um, I can't remember if it was something that you preached or something that I heard from a podcast, that, this was not the first time that the religious leaders of the day tried to kill Jesus, because they had tried to stone him once before,
Right. That's right.
and
Yeah.
he walked right away from
Walked
them.
away. Yeah.
And I believe that they had to turn him over to the Roman authorities because Rome was the only one that could institute the death penalty.
That's right.
And
So
didn't you say that
I
Sunday?
did I
Yeah,
did say that last part for sure Sunday that um most of the time the Jewish authorities wanted Rome to stay out of their
right,
conflict, right? They
right.
don't want Roman interference. First of all, the Roman officials don't understand any of this stuff anyway. All
Mhm.
these 613 laws, they didn't
Right,
even begin to try to understand that. It was just like a different language. Well, it was literally a different language. Um, but beyond that, at this point, they do invite Roman intervention because they don't have the right to declare the death penalty on anyone, and they want Jesus dead. The authorities are so serious about the problems that they think Jesus is raising up that they want him gone. And now the people seem to be drawn into this, or the average everyday people, because it seems to me they're disappointed. On Sunday, they hail him as the king on the
mhm,
way in to Jerusalem. And by Friday, they're calling for his death. And I think the reason for that is Jesus did not fulfill their political expectations. So, part of the very
right,
reason that Jesus is crucified is political, because Jesus didn't raise up an army and march on Rome and overthrow the Roman governor, which was never his intention. But some people must have thought that's what the Messiah was supposed to do, and Jesus didn't do it. So that's part of the dynamic that's going on in those last few days of Jesus' life.
right. I think that that kind of, um, s I don't wanna say supports, but that, makes me consider America and what a dynamic military force we have had, through both of the world wars and,
Sure.
different, wars and events since then, um, and the control that the states can sometimes have in the world because of our political power or our military power.
Sure.
Um, and I think that that's why it's very hard for us to understand that Jesus' messiahship and his kingdom is not gonna be fought and won that way. Um, it yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, no, it's just I think when we read that passage,
Mhm,
um, that the kingdom is not of this world. We have
mhm,
to think through what does that mean? And I talked about that briefly on
mhm,
Sunday, but there's really a lot more there because well, what is a kingdom that's not of this world? What does that even mean, right? I mean, we quote that and we say it's not of this world, but sometimes what we take that to mean is it doesn't have anything to do with this world, so it has no implications for this world. So that's all nice and spiritual, and yeah, we'll go off into heaven someday, and that's what he's talking about. But I don't think that's what he means. He says at the end of that verse, my kingdom is from another place. And I think that's really what he means when he says it's not of this world. It originated somewhere else. It is of a different order than the kingdoms of this world. Now, the kingdoms of this world are almost always about gathering power, right? Because we want
mhm,
our people to be more powerful than anybody else. And I'm talking about the vast sweep of history. I'm not talking about any one particular group, but that's the way that kingdoms have
mhm.
generally worked.
Yeah.
Because if we're in control, then we get to control where the resources go, whether we're talking about food or fuel or just about anything else. So when Jesus says my kingdom is of this world, I think he is in part saying my kingdom is not about control. My kingdom is not about power politics, although Jesus was powerful, but it's not about getting everything we want from everyone else. It is of a different order. And so we have a king who doesn't just gather power for himself, but gives his very life over. He surrender. I mean, there is I can't think of many more clear ways to surrender power than allow someone to kill you, right? And that's what Jesus
Mhm,
does. He could have brought all that to an end. We know he had the power because he walked through that crowd that was ready to stone him.
mhm,
And instead of doing that, when this crowd is taking him to the cross, Jesus surrenders his power and allows them to kill him. And so that's just one way that his kingdom is not like the other kingdoms of the world. And so he's operating in a way that, well, they struggled to understand in the first century. And I think we struggle to understand in our world just because the world does work in a different way than Jesus works. And as Christians, we're called to examine okay, if this is the Lord that we serve, and this is the way he used his power or refused to use his power, depending on what part of the story you're talking about. Well, what does that mean for us? And how does that apply to us as followers of Jesus? Does that mean we never use our power? Well, not necessarily, because maybe we need to protect the poor, the downtrodden. We need to protect
right,
someone that we love. So it's not that we never do that, but in what ways do we do that? And what does it mean to use it in a way that honors God? Those are all questions worth exploring that don't have easy answers, but each one of us needs to grapple with.
right. So earlier in John 18, which is what you were preaching in on Sunday, and where that text, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the
Right.
Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." Earlier in that same chapter, when they come to arrest Jesus, and this is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and it just blows my mind. Peter drew a sword and cut off
Right.
the right ear of one of the high priest's servants.
Right.
So, again, it's recorded in all 4 Gospels, so it's important for us to know this. And in each recording, Jesus either rebuked Peter or healed the man's ear. So
Right.
what is the lesson for us here? And does this relate at all to our encounters with opposing views in our world. I mean,
Well, I think it has to say something, right? Because we're
yeah.
here at Jesus' most, I mean, it's the critical moment in his whole lifespan.
Mhm.
He's about to be arrested. The cross is just hours away. He knows that. He knows that when he's taken in this moment, he's not going to return to his disciples before he dies. He's not going to have any more time with them. So this is one of the last things he says to one of his disciples before he dies. Now, there's a couple more lines that we get with Jesus talking to John and his mother from the cross,
Mhm.
but this is one of the last ones, nonetheless. And he tells Peter not to use physical force in this moment to get his way. Well, I think there's got to be something there that tells us when and how and why we exercise force of any kind. And that's not to say we never do. I don't think that's necessarily Jesus' message. But in this moment, it was not the proper response. Is it because he knew what needed to happen and he wanted to be sure that nothing stood in the way of him going to the cross because he knew that was the destiny that he needed to pursue? Is it because physical violence is always wrong? Is it because we should never protect ourselves? Well, there's been Christians who have argued every one of those positions. If you look
Mhm.
back through Christian
Yeah.
history, I think it's hard to go to the extremes, which those positions are really. But at least, at the very least, what we know is that Jesus is saying that in this moment, in this setting, that's not the right way. That's not the right path. And so when we're contemplating how we're going to exercise power, how we're going to pursue goals, how we're going to block people from pursuing a goal that we believe to be evil, I think it's definitely worth us thinking through what Jesus said in this moment and how does that apply to my life.
Right. I look at it and I see that Peter was being defensive. He
Right.
was trying to defend Jesus, but Jesus says, "I don't I don't need to be defended. I you know, in that verse he said to Pilate, "My servants would fight to prevent my arrest."
Right.
Um and he didn't want Peter to do that, but Peter was being defensive, and I think that sometimes that's our normal reaction. Our human minds and bodies, we're gonna defend our friends, our family, our belief system, and we're gonna fight back. And
Right. Well,
it's usually with our words or with our
sure.
whether it's written or spoken, social media, however, we're gonna defend. We have our right to defend our beliefs, and we think that we
And
have to.
we do. I mean, well, we have that, we've all probably read different things about, that reaction impulse,
Yeah,
fight or flight, right?
right,
So when we're
mhm,
challenged, we're either going to go to battle or we're going to say, I'm going to run away from this because it seems too dangerous. I don't think I can win. So we have to struggle with that. And I think you're right. I mean, in our world, we have been given a path to fight that's not physical
mhm,
and is impersonal in some ways, meaning that I can say things about someone, just virtually anyone on the planet, and I do not have to confront them, right? So I
right.
can do it on social media and I can say whatever it is I want to say about someone else without ever having to look them in the eye or even be in their presence, maybe for the rest of my life.
Well, and for the most part, you don't have to answer for it.
That's right.
I mean, you just, "Oh, this is my page, I can say what I want."
Right. And you can say what you want, but there's always consequences to
Mhm,
what you say for
yeah.
yourself and for others. And I think it's usually, well, it's always worth when we're in that moment and our anger is rising, and I mean, we feel threatened or we feel like someone we love is threatened
Mhm.
and we want to strike back in some way. You're right. A lot of times it's not going to be physical, it's going to be verbal. And we do well to take a pause
Yeah.
because what we're about to do could end up causing more harm than, or far more harm than
Oh,
good. It's
yeah.
not even designed to cause good, right?
So your suggestion is that we stay how to stay focused on the eternal kingdom when our lives are so enmeshed in the world we live in now. How can we do that? And your suggestion is we take a pause, take a breath,
Well, I think
and
that's
then
one, right?
yeah.
Because that battle of response is oftentimes verbal,
Mhm.
and we just have such easy ways to respond verbally now. So pause is a good thing. I think asking ourselves the question of whatever it is we're going to do, what's the purpose, right? I mean, is it just to strike back, or is there a constructive purpose that, okay, someone needs to be defended here? All right. Well, does defending someone we love mean striking back at the person who's causing the threat, or do we need to say, okay, there are terrible things being said about this person I love. Here's what I know to be true. So that maybe is more constructive, right? Because then
Yeah.
we're saying that this is what's right and good about this person who's being attacked, not this is what's so terrible about these awful people that have said this, which may be true. I'm not saying it's not, but I guess that the idea is to come back to motivation and what do we hope to accomplish with our words and deeds, even when we feel like we're attacked or someone we love is attacked.
Right. So as citizens of this eternal kingdom, as Christians, is it our job to fight it all? We want to reflect Christ and his kingdom of truth, grace, and eternal life. But there are
Right.
times when things have to be defended.
There are. And what are we fighting against?
Mhm.
Okay? So sometimes when we're facing a struggle, um the imagery that comes to mind is battle.
Mhm.
But the question then is, who am I going to war against? Who am I going to battle against? Am I putting myself in a place where I'm going to battle against another person? And is that really the right path or not? Um, and it depends on the situation too, right? I mean, if my one of my daughters is in danger and it's because someone is about to physically harm them, well, I'm probably going to put myself in the path of that
Mhm.
person so
Right.
that I can somehow defend them. But that's less often the case, right?
Right.
That's pretty far in the extreme. More often is, do I need to think of a person as the enemy or do I need to think of a spiritual power as the enemy? So, one way of thinking about these struggles is battle. But are there other images that we need to use? And is it best to always think of these struggles in terms of warfare? Is that the most helpful way to do it? Or are there other ways to think about it? For instance, another metaphor that we could use to describe a struggle is construction. Am I building something? Somebody may be trying to tear it apart, but am I building something that's going to last? So is my struggle in building something up that matters, or is my struggle warfare? Well, I mean, it seems like it's just a change of mindset, and it is, but I think it affects how we decide to deal with the struggle. It changes how we understand what we're trying to do. So I think it's helpful to at least explore what are other ways of thinking about this problem than just me going to war with somebody. Is
Okay.
there another way to do this?
So your sermons so far have been on virtues, and we talked about that
Right.
earlier, that we should emulate and develop. And I feel like this is going to be a struggle against our human nature because we're generally human beings want to meet their own needs first before they
Sure.
and their own wants before they do anything else. So, in our natures, in our character, not so that we just have the reputation of being unified as a church or humble in our spirits, but that we would actually have character when no one's even around of those
Mhm.
things. How do we fight our human nature for truth, grace, and eternal life when there seems to be um, kind of a battle in our own selves
Yeah.
for our reputation, our character, our very soul. There's
Right.
that verse, the devil's going around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. We don't want to be devoured. How do we fight against that?
Well, I think we can go back to what Jesus said. So he says, the law tells you you can't kill someone,
Mhm.
but I say, don't hate someone.
Mhm.
The law says don't lust after another person or don't commit adultery, but I say don't lust after another person.
Mhm.
Jesus goes back to character,
Mhm.
and
Every
and
time.
character should be the same whether we're in a group of a dozen friends, a crowd of 500, or whether we're alone. Our character is the same. It's a matter of whether we're trying to pretend we're something we're not.
Mhm.
So I think Jesus' advice there or Jesus' instruction is just right on that we need to look inside. So whether I'm with this person or with a dozen people who don't like this person, the way I can keep myself from physical violence is to watch what's going on in my head. What am I saying to myself about this person? Am I building up an animosity, a hatred for that person? Because that's going to lead me to sin. So I need to change the way that I think, and
Mhm.
that's closer to character than just what we do. Whether we're talking about, hatred or lust or any other negative thing that we could pursue, that keeps us from sin and helps us be the right person, whether anybody's around or not. So that one piece, there's probably more to that, but I think
Yeah,
that's where Jesus goes on that issue.
right. I think, when we talk about character and who you are, um, when you're by yourself and trying to fight for truth and grace and in your own mind and in your own heart and have these virtues and care and fruits of the spirit that are going to make us more Christ-like. I can remember moments when I have struggled with just my mind keeps creating, or at the time my mind kept creating arguments, and I would argue these points, or
Mm,
I would imagine a confrontation, some situation I was not really wanting to do, or conversation I wasn't wanting to have. Sometimes it could be politics, sometimes it could be social issues, sometimes it could just be um, feeling like I had to defend myself for every little thing. Like I
right,
was like Peter, I was defensive, and I was defensive even when I was alone because my mind was preparing me for these fictitious arguments that I was pretty sure were going to happen. And
right,
so I had to train my mind. I had to really practice and spend a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time feeding my mind good things. And what would you kind of what I guess if I had come to you when I was living defensively, when I was in that place, how would you have encouraged me to put off that mind and
hmm
figure out how to um, just be centered on Christ instead of living defensively?
right. I think we're all guilty of. Oh, I know I am.
Mhm.
Dealing with those imaginary
Yeah.
conversations, or what I'm actually more guilty of is thinking about things that I could have said in a conversation that already
Yes.
happened,
Mhm.
you know? So, like, someone challenged me and I didn't have a great response in the moment, but, for 2 weeks after, I'm thinking about all
That's
the
all you can
good
think about.
things that
Yeah.
I should have said to that
Yes.
person
Yeah.
and didn't. And so I'm reimagining that conversation over and over and over, and more often than not, it's not very healthy. Um, because I'm probably not gonna have that conversation again, and I'm just trying to find ways that I could have come out sort of on top of that rather
Right.
than feeling a little lost in the moment. So what do we do in response to that? And I think it's one of those things that's hard, hard, hard to just turn off. Like, okay, well, I'm just not going to think about that anymore. One of the hardest things to do is to tell ourselves not to think about something, not to go down that same rabbit trail that we know really only leads to anxiety or
Right.
depression or anger or fear. And we know if we start down that path, that's where we're headed, and yet we somehow can't seem to keep ourselves from going there again. And I think what you said is actually the right thing. You said that you had to work on filling your mind with other things, and I think that's really the key there. Saying, "I'm not gonna think about this," usually doesn't work.
Right.
Focusing on something that is of value, or is something that we know sort of diffuses our stress or anger or fear, whether it's some kind of physical activity. I mean, we all have our different places that are our places that we know create calm, whether it's in your, in the outdoors or in your garden, or whether it's in your kitchen
Right.
or in your craft room or in your wood shop, or, it just depends on our makeup as to where those things are. But finding things to pursue and to use our minds on that are going to be de-stressing or constructive in some other way is usually a whole lot better than sort of sitting still and saying, okay, I'm not going to think about that. Now, there's a
Right.
place for mindfulness and there's a place for, prayer and seeking God out in those moments. So I don't want to exclude that. But just trying to avoid thoughts is, at least for me,
Yeah.
very challenging.
Yeah, because if you're trying to avoid a thought and not replace it with something else, you're just like, "I'm not gonna think about it, I'm not gonna think about it, not gonna think about
Right.
it," and then that's all you think about. It's like
Right.
when
I
someone
always use
tells
the
you,
example of,
yeah,
yeah, well, I always use
"Don't
the
look
example
down."
of, yeah, don't think of a red balloon.
Right.
Okay, now what did you just do? Because that's what we all do,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's
Mhm.
impossible not to do that. So if we say, don't think about that conversation that we had with someone that was really hurtful, maybe it
Right.
happened last week, maybe it happened 30 years ago.
Right.
That is so hard to do,
Yeah.
but taking our minds somewhere else. Now, I mean, one sort of footnote to that, I think,
Mhm.
is we sometimes do have to process some of those difficult conversations that have happened, and just to sort
Yes.
of deny that they happened or shut them down, try to ignore them, block them out. That's not always the best thing, right? I mean, there's a
Right.
place for processing. There's a place for going to someone that we trust and working through the feelings that all that may have created. So I'm not saying that we should be blind to our feelings or try to ignore those, but I do think that on a daily basis, we don't need to dwell on those things over and over and over
Right.
again because it usually is not healthy.
Healthy processing does not involve obsessive
Well,
self
that's exactly right.
whatever. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's
Um,
exactly right.
um, so, um that back to the points in the sermon. I
Yeah.
guess we've kinda gotten away from it a little bit, but,
Well, that's all right.
not really. So politics is important, but they will fade away. And while issues matter now, they may not matter later. The big issues that matter now, they're the ones that tend to divide us, and we can't ignore them, but we also need to frame them correctly and set them within the context or perspective of eternity.
And the thing that I said, and I'm not even sure I said it in both services, but that rings true to me is that the issues that were so important in elections that have passed.
Mhm.
I mean, we could even say, 30 or 40 years ago, but certainly if we look back 100 years ago, nobody cares about
Right.
anymore. And so some of these things, again, not saying they don't matter today or that we should just ignore them or Christians shouldn't think through these things or stand for what's right or wrong. Just recognize their place, that some
Right.
of these issues are not long-term issues and are certainly not eternal issues. We may need to
Right.
work on them. We may need to plan. We may need to have, ways that our country works through them, but they're not paramount for
Right.
eternity. And that's really what I was getting to there.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the things that don't count for eternity.
Right.
So nationality affects who we are now, but it does not define who we are for eternity.
Right. And we talked about that in terms of identity already, but
Yes.
I do think that's one that's, many of us, we are Americans and we take great pride in that because uh, we look and say we live in one of the greatest nations in the history of the world. Well, that's probably true. Um, but we also know that, wow, there are other cultures and nations that are work around the world that have great value as well, and that we don't ever even have contact with, so we don't know
Mhm.
anything about them. But those people also take great pride in who they are
Right.
and what the culture has given them. So all those things do matter, but in the end, when we are spending eternity together praising God, it just won't matter. I
Right.
don't think it's going to make any difference at all.
So I think there's a couple things that came to mind for me.
Yeah,
One is that um be in the world but not of the world.
right.
And I think that is that Paul that says that
Yeah,
somewhere?
I
Be
think
in the
so.
world but not of the world. But I think we can't be so and talking of a heavenly kingdom or eternal kingdom and an earthly kingdom, I think that it's important that we base our lives on the eternal kingdom, but we can't be, and I think I've said this before, so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good.
Right.
But we
And
don't
Jesus was clear
yeah.
about that, right? I
Yes.
mean,
And I was just going through John, and in John 17, he said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to
mhm,
God what is God's." So he was not
mhm,
anti I don't wanna say submissive. He submit to the authorities that are over you, right?
right,
That's what we're supposed to do. Um, but we also have to be aware that it's not eternal. The
right, and
authorities over Yeah.
we have a higher allegiance,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yes.
I mean, if those 2 things are in conflict, then we have to figure out, okay, what do I do, right? If
Right.
and maybe they're not even in conflict, but how do they work together?
Right.
How do I understand being an American? But, we could ask this for every other country in the world. How am I a subject of the King of England and
Right.
still a Christian?
Right.
How am I, what does it mean to be a citizen of the nation of Japan and still be a Christian? So, and those questions are going to be different in different cultures because the culture is different.
Well, and China, there
Sure.
it's like, isn't it illegal to
Yes, and I read an article this week, as a matter of fact, that talked about the fact that by 2050, I think was the year, and
Mhm.
that number might not be right, but I think that was it. That there will probably be more Christians if numbers continue the way they are. There'll be more Christians in China than there are in the United States,
Oh my gosh.
where it is legal to be a Christian,
Right.
whether you're
Yeah,
allowed to go to church every
that's
Sunday.
crazy.
Whereas in China, depending on where you are and all things,
Mhm.
not every Christian is arrested, but it's still,
Yeah.
there is persecution going on,
Yeah.
and yet that's where the church is growing.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So, let's see. I don't know where we're going here. We do have a um, I think, it's important to kind of point out that, um, we do have tools to fight, um, in the spiritual kingdom, the helmet of salvation, belt
Right.
of truth, sword of the spirit, and I think that those were given to us to maintain our Christian integrity
Sure.
and not lose it by, um, trying to fight, I would say, a spiritual battle with our human wit and intelligence.
Right.
I mean, we are given those things, but when we don't use them correctly, they're gonna cause division and controversy rather than peace. And sometimes
Correct. And
even when given in peace and truth and love, they're not gonna be always received with the right
yeah,
intention.
and then it's just up to us to do what we know is right.
Mhm.
And the other person may or may not receive it in the way that we intended, and we can't always control that.
Right.
But, we have almost all of us have at one point or another been on the receiving end of truth and right, but it didn't feel so good because of the way it was delivered. Now, sometimes just because we don't want to hear the truth,
Right, yeah.
but
Been there.
sometimes it's because it has been expressed in such an unloving, unhelpful kind of
Right.
way that it feels harmful.
And I've been
Um,
there too and delivered it
yeah.
that way a time or 2. And
Oh, I
so
probably have
that's
too. Sure. Yeah. I mean,
it's hard to do. It is hard to do this thing right. And
especially when we feel
yes.
self-righteous about
Oh,
something.
yeah.
I know I'm right, and
Yeah.
so they've got to hear this.
Yeah. I
I mean,
think yeah. I
parenting comes to mind in
yes.
those moments,
Yeah.
because I'm sure I've delivered the truth in ways that were not inviting
No,
and
I'm yeah.
loving in the way that
Yeah.
I could have.
Yeah. So I think, it's important to remember that the truth with delivered in a way that Jesus wants will
Right.
convict rather than condemn. If
Right.
if there's a condemning connotation or, lilt to our conversation, I guess, we're not doing it right. We can just
Right.
know we're not doing it right.
Right.
Um, but if the Holy Spirit convicts them, then that's when we're gonna see some changes, whether it's, a political conversation or an eternal life conversation, either
Correct.
one. We have to
Right.
let the truth of God do the convicting rather than us doing the condemning because that's not gonna help anybody.
Yep.
All right, so let's see. I think we have a connect card question.
We do. And someone decided to ask a hard question.
Yes,
That's not fair.
it was
Right.
a very hard one. um, so here it is, word for word. How do we cope with people who possess power or control over us if they are someone who truly are not a boss or authority figure? They're just kind of being a bully, I guess. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that is exactly the way it was worded. And this is one of those that, boy, I'd love to know a little more about what's behind this question. It is a good question and a hard question, and clearly there's more to that story, which is okay that they didn't tell it. That's not a
Oh, yeah,
problem. I'm
yeah,
glad
for
they asked
sure.
the question, but I wish I had more context for it. But this is real, okay?
Mhm,
This is at work in our world, and we think about bullying. Usually when we use the word bully, we think somehow about um, kids or teenagers. We think about when we're growing up and the bullying that goes on in
mhm,
schools today. But it doesn't end at 18. It doesn't end with your high school diploma. There are people who are bullies throughout life and
mhm.
operate that way. They always have to express power and control in all their relationships. And those are not good people to be around most of the time. And I guess part of my thought in response to that is, um, if you cannot be around that person, it's probably better, right? I mean, people who use their power to get their way in all their relationships are not good for us. Now, it may be that this is somebody you can't just walk away from because of the family situation or work situation or whatever it may be. And then we have to figure out how to deal with that. And when we were kids, everybody said, "Well, just stand up to the bully and they'll back down." Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. Some bullies are just strong people who are not going to back down. So that might or might not work. I think standing up for what is right and true, and knowing that may not change this person. They may be just as difficult and obnoxious, even if we do what is the right thing. And at one level, we just have to let them. And we can't necessarily change them. Now, if they're being abusive, that's a different thing, right?
Right.
We can't, I don't think scripture ever calls us to just endure abuse because it's being dished out. So I don't mean that at all. But if there's any way to limit our interaction with someone like that, I think it's probably a good thing. And if we can speak the truth and let them know the truth, and maybe they'll accept it, maybe they won't. I still think that's good too. So there's no perfect answer here because I mean, if we're in a situation where there is no way to walk away from this person, to remove ourselves from their presence because they're at work every day or they're at home every day,
Mhm.
um, it is really hard, and we should not be subjected to that kind of bullying, whether we're kids in school or whether we're adults at work or at home. And, you know, using the strength that we have from the power of God at work in us, I think is a good thing. Um, but I don't have a perfect answer to this. I don't know. What do you think, Monica? Maybe you
Well,
have a better answer than I do.
I think there are a lot of levels of, where this can be because in
Yeah,
my
right.
profession, I am looking at, um, a possible situation which probably didn't cross your mind because you've not lived this situation yet, but, an elderly parent who is being taken care of in a home that I'm not at,
Yeah,
and if one of my parents was being bullied just by a caretaker, "Oh, get your" the way someone's talking to
sure.
them about how they shower
Absolutely.
or hurrying up or this or that, and, you know, uh, that's intimidating, that's control, and that's not the way someone should be treated.
Right, because if this person is dependent on this
Exactly.
caretaker, whether they're family
Yes.
or not, and they might
Right.
be, they might not be,
Yeah.
then that's one of those places where it's hard to remove yourself, right? You
Right.
can't
Right.
because you're gonna face this person over and over and over. That's tough.
It is, and, I would, if it's anything like that, if there is abuse, neglect, if there is a way that you can talk to someone,
Right.
even even if confrontation is not an option, talk to someone
You need an advocate.
who can advocate for you.
Right.
That's the thing. Jesus is our advocate, no doubt about it. We can pray to him, ask him what to do, ask him to send us someone, but definitely look for an opportunity or create an opportunity to talk to someone.
Yep, that's good.
So
That's good.
that's where I would go with that. And sometimes just being able to talk to someone about it, you can get a better perspective if it's, like a school or a work bully situation. But if it's a situation where someone has control over you, and you're dependent on them, that's even if they're not a boss or an authority figure, if it's a dependent caretaker, spouse, sibling, whatever,
Mhm.
child, um, yeah, that's what I would say is pray about your situation, definitely talk to someone, find an advocate. So
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So, I think that the question 10 here on our list, I think you've pretty much answered it. It was, what are your thoughts on our spiritual battles and overcoming our fleshly responses, which get in the way of unity, humility, and kindness? I think we kind of hit on that
Yeah,
earlier.
right.
Yeah, kind of weaved it into the conversation. So, my favorite question of the podcast: what was the most impactful piece of this sermon or this series for you?
Well, and I think you alluded to this earlier, that that last point, that these things are not eternal. Whether we're talking about our nationality, or we're talking about our differences with other people, or our politics, or our polarization. I mean, that really is that's the final word in my mind
Mhm.
about this whole series. That the things that we're dealing with, when we say this, it's not to say they don't matter, they're not important, because that's not true. Some of the things that are involved in our politics right now are really important and involve people's lives, even life and death.
Mhm.
So to say, well, they don't matter, no, I'm not saying that at all. But like our nationality, important to me, matters to me, thankful for it, but not eternal. And
Right.
so the brotherhood and sisterhood that I share with other followers of Jesus, that's going to last for an eternity, far more important.
Yes.
That's at the core of who I am. And even though I don't always acknowledge that, even though I don't always think about that, I need to, and I need to do better at that. And we just get, at least I do. I, live my life, and I'm surrounded by this sort of this similar group of people all the time. And there are a lot of church people, and I'm in church building every day. And that becomes my world, and it becomes a really small world if I'm not careful.
Mhm.
And it's good for us to think more broadly than that. And that some of the things that even in this building may divide us because of politics or personality or whatever else, where they pale in comparison to where we're headed, and that's to spending eternity together praising God. So that's where my focus should be more often than it is.
Yep. That's good. All right. So feel free, everybody, to email or text us what the most impactful piece of the sermon was for you. And send your questions in. Next week will probably be a little bit different because we have a guest speaker Sunday.
Right, right. And that'll be
S-
good because we're having ordination
Oh,
service.
yes.
Neil, our student minister, is going to be ordained, and his dad, who's a preacher, is going to be speaking. So we might talk a little about that. Might talk a little bit about ordination itself, what's that all
Yeah.
about. We'll see. We'll
All
work through
right.
that.
So, all right. Well, don't forget to send your questions in. You can do that by, or comments. We'll be happy to read just comments. So just send them in. Text 217-712-6621 or email us at questions@taylorvillechristian.com. And again, those connect cards, that seems to be the preferred way. So send those in as well. So for now, we will say goodbye and have a great rest of your week.
See you next time.
Bye.